Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the National Sea Grant Law Center's webinar series. My name is Stephanie Otts. I'm the director of the National Sea Grant Law Center. And today we're going to talk about executive orders. So this is the third webinar for this year. The first one we focused on uh, what Congress had been doing, so statutory changes at the end of 2020. The second one, we went down a level and talked about regulations. And then today are executive orders. So if you've missed any of the previous webinars, the recordings are available on the National Sea Grant Law Center's webpage. We are also recording this webinar and we'll post it afterwards. So if any of your colleagues weren't able to join us today, they can get the information. And so, yeah, I don't know about you. It has felt like a bit like whiplash between the Trump and the Biden administrations. This was not unanticipated. Obviously, the policy differences between the two administrations are quite significant. And so we anticipated a lot of changes, but so today, just going to give a brief introduction to the National Sea Grant Law Center in case there's anybody new on the call who's not familiar with us. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of Executive Order 101, and then to give some quick status updates of key Trump or Biden executive orders. There has been a lot of activity on this front. We are not going to touch on everything. We will probably miss some executive actions that you are interested in. So, please feel free throughout the webinar to use the chat box. If there is something in particular you're curious about that we don't cover today, we are happy to follow up after the webinar. So send us an email anytime. So those who don't know, the National Sea Grant Law Center is one of the 34 Sea Grant programs. We're based at the University of Mississippi School of Law. We are established to provide non-advocacy legal research, outreach, and education services to the Sea Grant Network. And so this is part of those efforts to provide information to all of you about what's happening kind of out there in the law and policy realm with regards to ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes resources. So a reminder, don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook. That Twitter especially is the best place to kind of stay up to date with what we're working on. But our website is also frequently updated, and I encourage you to check out all of the resources that we have available online. Also wanted to mention that for the individuals on the call who are from Sea Grant programs, we do have our advisory service. This is a legal research service provided free of charge to Sea Grant programs. And we can't give legal advice, so it's limited to research, but we do strive to answer as many questions from the network as we can. So if you have a legal question, our advisory service is here to help. So please send me an email at any time if you would like to learn more information about that. There is also information on our website, guidelines for our advisory service and how you can ask questions. Okay. So first, just wanted to start with a brief look at executive orders. What are they? How do they work? What are some of the basics? So, and sorry, the slides are a little blurry. We've been working on a draft infographic, and I converted our infographic into slides, and we got lost a little bit of the clarity on them. But so stay tuned. This is a work in progress for our infographic. But executive orders are basically the president's directive to staff and heads of federal agencies to do something. So they're directing action by other executive branch entities. On the state level, they would be a governor's directive. Executive orders are created using the president's authority provided by the Constitution under Article 2, or sometimes it's delegated to the president by Congress. Some key things about executive orders to always keep in mind. The executive orders direct action agencies or direct agency action on certain things, new policy initiatives or policy priorities of the president, but they do not immediately change the law. So agencies implement executive orders either by changing their policies or issuing new regulations. So the impact of an executive order can really vary depending on what it's asking the agencies to do. Sometimes executive orders are about things like personnel issues and HR that agencies can just change their internal policies. But sometimes it's asking agencies to develop new programs or streamline a regulation like what the seafood executive order asked the Corps of Engineers to consider issuing a new nationwide permit, right? That has to be done through a regulation. And so it really depends on the buy-in of the agencies, right? Like a president can issue an executive order, but if the agency isn't really keen on doing what the president wants, they can drag their feet. Or if they're all on board and it's something that they really want to do, they move ahead with it, right? And so it's only applicable to the executive branch. And so an executive order can't tell Congress what to do. It can't tell a state what to do. It's very limited into who is being directed by the action. So executive orders, though, do have the force of law if the president had the authority to issue the order. They are published in the Federal Register when they are issued. And so the Biden administration executive orders are available on the White House website, but they've also been published in the Federal Register. So then what are the limits on executive orders? So these are not, I'm sure many have heard the conversations around executive orders, this isn't necessarily the most effective or efficient way to change government policy because they can be revoked by later presidents. They can also be nullified by courts if the court finds that the president lacked authority to issue the order. But current presidents may revoke executive orders issued by any previous president. So by the stroke of a pen, an executive order can be gone. And we'll see in our discussion later for the rest of the webinar, the Biden administration has been revoking Trump administration orders. And then just one thing we wanted to point out, today's webinar, we're focusing mainly on executive orders, but there are a lot of different types of executive actions. And so you may have heard of proclamations. There are also memos. And so what's the difference, right? So executive orders are signed, they're numbered consecutively, they have the force of law. They're always published in the Federal Register. Proclamations are the same way. These are signed, published, they have the force of law. Many of you may be familiar with proclamations that establish national monuments. So those are really big proclamations, but we also have proclamations about, certain days, what month it is, those type of things that a president does. And then there's just the other executive actions that are memos or directives to agencies. So those are not numbered. They're not always signed. Sometimes they're published in the Federal Register, sometimes not. So it just depends. And they often don't have, those other actions don't have the force of law. So with that background, just wanted to kind of start with our quick takes. This was not an executive order, but I thought it was important to mention the memo issued by the Biden administration. regarding a regulatory freeze pending review. And this follows up a little bit to some of the information that we covered on our webinar last month. This memo was issued on January 20th. So the first day that the Biden administration was in office. It called on a freeze on proposing or issuing rules until the Biden administration has a chance to review them. So this really impacted any regulation that was in the process of being proposed or finalized. There's a lot of different possible outcomes from this review process. One could be that for non-controversial rules that the Biden administration doesn't have a problem with, the rule will just move forward as planned and the agency will issue it. For final rules that had already been published as a final rule by the Trump administration, the memo called for agencies to consider delaying the effective date and having an additional comment period, just as a way to collect more information to figure out how they want to move forward. If a proposed rule had been published but has not yet been finalized, so it hasn't gone through that last step in the regulatory process, we may see changes to the final rule. So the Biden administration may come out with a final rule, but it might be slightly different than the proposed rule. Although there are limits under federal law about how many changes an agency can make between the proposed rule and the final rule. Or we might never see a final rule. So the Biden administration agencies might just say, you know what, we don't want to move forward with this proposal. Oops, one of my slides didn't work. I just had one example. I'll go back to, so the one example of this is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act rule. So in January, the Fish and Wildlife Service under the Trump administration issued a rule that would have changed some of the standards relating to what violations are considered for take of migratory birds. It was very controversial. The Department of Interior solicitor's memo that rule was based on had been struck down in court, yet the Trump administration moved forward with their final rule. In early February, the Biden administration published a notice that they were delaying the effective date of that rule until March 8th, and they had reopened the comment period until March 1st. And so that's just an example of how this regulatory freeze and review is moving forward. Yeah. In addition to the memo, the Biden administration also issued an executive order related to federal regulations. This was one of their first executive orders. It was issued in late January. It revoked 6 executive orders that had been issued by the Trump administration that related to regulatory reform. The one order that got the most attention out of these 6 was probably what's known as the 2-for-1 order. This was the executive order issued by the Trump administration that said for every one regulation an agency issues, they need to get rid of 2. Right. You know, that wasn't necessarily implemented across the board on all agencies, but that order has been revoked by the Biden administration. The executive order also directs agencies to promptly take steps to rescind any, regulations, guidance, policies that they had that were implementing one of the 6 orders that had been revoked. So the agencies will kind of be going back and cleaning up some of the things that they were working on with respect to those orders. And with that, we're going to start turning things over to other members of the team to talk about some of the other executive orders.
Thanks. So President Biden issued an executive order titled Promoting COVID-19 Safety in Domestic and International Travel, and he issued that on January 21st. The EO states that mask wearing and physical distancing are critical to preventing the spread of COVID and to protect the public health. So the order directs several agency heads, including the US Coast Guard, to take actions to ensure that all travel activities are consistent with CDC guidelines. So specifically, the order directed the US Coast Guard to require masks to be worn in compliance with CDC guidelines on public maritime vessels and all forms of public transportation. So in response to this, the Coast Guard issued a COVID-19 Marine Safety Information Bulletin, and that directed vessels to implement these CDC guidelines and allowed for there to be sanctions if masks weren't worn on board. So the safety bulletin order applies to all commercial vessels on waters within federal jurisdiction. Thanks, I'll pass it along to Tara.
Hi, so I'm going to talk about this EO titled Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities Through the Federal Government. This one was issued on January 20th, 2021, so it was President Biden's first day in office. And under this EO, each agency must assess whether and to what extent its programs and policies perpetuate systemic barriers to opportunities and benefits for people of color and other underserved groups. Under the order, the director of the Office of Management and Budget must work with federal agencies to identify a way to first assess equity. And then the agencies must review their programs to see whether they have barriers for underserved communities in accessing benefits and opportunities that are available. The director of OMB must also allocate resources to advance fairness and opportunity in the president's budget, and with federal agencies, determine how to allocate federal resources to meet these goals. And within 1 year of the date of the order, the head of each agency must produce a plan for addressing any barriers to participating in enrollment in or access to benefits and services in federal programs, as well as any barriers to full and equal participation in agency procurement and contracting opportunities. The EO also establishes the Interagency Working Group on Equitable Data. This is just a working group designed to gather data on equity in federal data collection programs and policies. It will work on gathering federal data sets by race, ethnicity, gender, disability, income, veteran status, or other key demographic variables in order to measure and advance equity. Importantly, this executive order revokes a couple from the Trump administration. First is executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. This was the order that tried to limit federal contractors and the recipients of federal grants from discussing what they called divisive topics in workplace trainings on issues of diversity and inclusion, including what the order called stereotyping and scapegoating on the basis of race or sex. And that order generated significant controversy and confusion for employers who were trying to pursue D&I initiatives. And then in December of 2020, a federal district court had issued a nationwide preliminary injunction banning its enforcement. The court found that key provisions of the rule were unconstitutional restrictions on free speech, as well as impermissibly vague. So the president's action formally rescinded the rule in its entirety. The EO also revoked the executive order issued in November by the Trump administration, establishing the President's Advisory 1776 Commission that was related to teaching patriotism in schools. So the next one I'm going to talk about is preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. This was also issued on January 20th. It's an order aimed at protecting the rights of LGBTQ plus community. The EO requires the head of all federal agencies to listing regulations, guidance, documents, policies, or programs in the interest of fostering diversity and inclusion efforts. The executive order recognizes a U.S. Supreme Court decision that held that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act's prohibition on discrimination on the basis of sex extends to prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. And this executive order states that Title VII and any federal laws or regulations aimed at sex discrimination also prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. EO requires the heads of all federal agencies to review their existing regulations, orders, and guidance related to endorsing or implementing Title VII or any of the other federal laws that prohibit sex discrimination to ensure they're consistent in their protection of the LGBTQ plus status, and if necessary, to take administrative action to revise those. And then within 100 days, the head of each agency must deliver a plan to carry out actions that align with this executive order. So with that, I'll pass it back to Olivia.
Thanks. So on January 26th, President Biden issued a memorandum on tribal consultation and strengthening the nation-to-nation relationship. So this memorandum reaffirms and sets deadlines for a previous executive order, which was number 13175. So for background information, Executive Order 13175 was issued by President Clinton in 2000 and then reaffirmed by memorandum issued by President Obama in 2009. And that order and subsequent memo state a policy of recognizing tribal sovereignty and the right to self-government and self-determination. And it established a consultation policy where federal agencies were directed to establish consultation guidelines and procedures for implementing those. So President Obama's memo required agencies to submit plans of action for how the agency would meet these sovereignty and consultation policies. So then moving forward to now, President Biden's memorandum affirms this policy and it directs agencies to submit a plan of action for how it will accomplish consultation within 90 days. And the memo also requires agencies to designate an agency official who will be responsible for carrying out and reporting on these directives. And then the Office of Management and Budget is required to prepare a report for President Biden within 1 year. Next slide, please. President Biden issued an executive order on January 20th titled Protecting Public Health and the Environment and Restoring Science to Tackle the Climate Crisis. There are four kind of main categories of actions that this EO discusses. First, it states a policy to promote public health and the environment, to protect national monuments, and states the benefits of reducing climate pollution. Second, it directs executive departments to review all federal regulations promulgated in the last 4 years that might conflict with this policy and then submit a report to OMB. Third, it directs the Secretary of Interior along with other agencies to review all national monument boundaries and conditions and then determine whether a monument is fit for restoration or the conditions that existed before 2017. And then the fourth action that I wanted to spend a little time on is the executive order places a moratorium on the oil and gas leasing program in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So for review, President Trump proposed a leasing program as part of the 2017 Tax Act. And in early January of this year, there was a lease sale, and it ended up only 3 companies bid and were awarded leases in this area. So this current executive order placed a moratorium on all leasing in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and directed the Secretary of Interior to review the leasing program and conduct a new analysis of environmental impacts of the oil and gas program. So I think a couple of important things to note are that even though there was a lease sale, that doesn't necessarily mean that the oil is going to be extracted. The agency can suspend a lease after it does further environmental review or decline to issue other permits or authorizations that would be needed for the project. Alternatively to that, though, leaseholders, after they have been awarded a lease, which is like a legal right to take steps to pursue oil exploration, there may be, in some circumstances, the right to sue the federal government for failing to meet the lease terms. One other note is that this is not a permanent protection of the refuge. The executive order is only directing the agency to review the environmental impacts of the lease sales. Thanks.
Great. I'll pick it up from here. My name's Zach Klein. I am the other Ocean and Coastal Law Fellow here at the National Sea Grant Law Center. I'm going to be one of 2 attorneys talking about Executive Order 14008, which concerns tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. This executive order was issued on January 27th, which is no coincidence because January 27th is World Climate Day. President Biden used that as an opportunity to issue this executive order, which has significant implications for US policy concerning climate. There are implications both in terms of our international commitments, which do eventually get reflected in domestic law or policy. And then there are also going to be some separate domestic implications that I'll cover in the next slide. Starting with the international, though, the executive order reaffirmed the United States' commitment to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, even though this was something President Biden had already expressed an interest in. This was a document at the domestic level that formally got that policy into writing and, more importantly, set into motion 2 processes. The first is the process to develop nationally determined contribution, our nationally determined contribution, or NDC. The NDC is the emissions reduction target that the United States is going to have for the coming decades. However, it is not binding. It is theoretically aspirational, although that'll ultimately depend on how the policy gets incorporated into US law, the flexibility that we'll have moving forward, or the lack thereof. Additionally, this also called for the creation of a climate finance plan. The climate finance plan is supposed to have 2 roles. The first role is that it's supposed to create a pot of funds that are available to assist developing nations in adopting climate-friendly technologies. It's also supposed to help encourage investment to move away from very carbon-intensive practices and carbon-intensive investments and towards more climate-friendly investments. It's included as part of this umbrella sort of window for the Paris Climate Agreement because even though the executive order doesn't specifically reference the 2 together like that, this concept is very close to what the Paris Agreement calls the Green Climate Fund, which is a pot of funds taken from international contributions that more or less serves a similar purpose. So something to keep an eye on moving forward as that climate finance plan develops is whether or not it ends up being put forward or formally adopted as the US's contributions towards the Paris Agreement's Green Climate Fund. So that's the Paris Climate Agreement. The other very interesting development when it comes to international obligations is that this executive order directs the State Department to send the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol to the Senate for approval. So, and I apologize that one of the words is a little pushed out of the way there by a refrigerator, perhaps an apt metaphor, because the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol sort of arose in a context where back in the 80s, there were concerns about the ozone, that it was deteriorating and that it was exacerbating what we now know as climate change or global warming. And what they found was that one of the biggest contributors to the depletion of the ozone were chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, and then hydrochlorofluorocarbons, HCFCs. They are most commonly found, or they were most commonly found, in refrigerators, in air conditioning units, and aerosols. If you've ever heard aerosols are bad for the environment, that's exactly where that comes from. And so the Montreal Protocol was adopted in the late 80s to help phase out CFCs and HCFCs. One of the ways that happened was through the introduction of hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, that could be used as a replacement for CFCs and HCFCs without causing this damage to the ozone layer. And the good news is that it did work. The bad news is that even though it wasn't bad for the ozone, as it turns out, HFCs are also very good at retaining heat and themselves are also exacerbating climate change, increasing ocean temperatures, sea level rise, etc. So the Kigali Amendment was signed in 2016 as a binding obligation of countries to start phasing out HFCs as well. We're a little late to the party when it comes to this treaty because as of now, there are 112 countries that have formally ratified it. It technically went into effect back in 2019, but because we haven't formally ratified it yet through the Senate advice and consent process outlined in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, we aren't formally a party yet. So even though this executive order doesn't formally make us a party, it does direct the Senate to send the Kigali Amendment, to consider the Kigali Amendment for approval, formal ratification. Next slide, please. There were also some important domestic implications. This was a very ambitious executive order, and my colleague Kathy Janessi is going to be covering some of the specifics that we thought deserved more attention. But just at a big picture level, one of the things that this executive order very much emphasized is that climate is now an essential element of US foreign policy and national security. So that is going to have implications for how the cost of climate change is considered, maybe not in terms of financial dollars necessarily, but certainly as agencies are to consider the impacts of various environmental issues related to climate change, you might see foreign policy and national security come up more than they have in the past. It also, the executive order creates the White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy and the National Climate Task Force. The White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy is going to be chaired by the newly created Office of the National Climate Advisor. The first one is going to be former Administrator of the EPA, Gina McCarthy. And something of interest, one way that these two entities are related, the Office of Domestic Climate Policy and the task force, is that the National Climate Advisor is going to chair the National Climate Task Force. And the task force itself is made up of 21 federal agencies and departments. This includes the usual suspects like the EPA, Department of Energy, Interior, but also the Attorney General, Transportation, General Services Administration, Department of Defense and Homeland Security, of course. So there's going to be a lot more interagency cooperation when it comes to climate change and how US policy can better adapt to it. In terms of some specifics that were also directives stemming from this executive order, it prohibits federal agencies from subsidizing fossil fuels. Now, this is only limited to more or less line item expenses that are called subsidies. As it turns out, a lot of the subsidies for fossil fuels come in the form of tax cuts, and those can only be removed or changed through congressional action. So that's something to keep an eye on, whether Congress ends up acting on that, but that is ultimately beyond the scope of this executive order. Another action of interest is that this executive order created a moratorium on new oil and gas leases. So previous oil and gas leases that were already in existence are unaffected by this moratorium. However, any that were not issued yet are effectively frozen until further notice. We don't know how long this moratorium is going to last. It, in theory, is not supposed to be forever. There is a process that is outlined in the executive order with respect to what should be considered by various federal agencies as they determine oil and gas lease processes moving forward. And in a bigger picture perspective, this moratorium was imposed in part in order to help give a leg up to alternative energies, especially offshore alternative energies, namely wind energy, and there are some other projects out there from non-wind when it comes to offshore waters, but wind is the primary benefactor of this. And it's as part of this moratorium, there's also supposed to be a review of lease processes for renewable energy sources, like I said, namely wind. And the hope is that regardless of whether oil and gas leases are eventually reissued, that this will create sort of a regulatory benefit, a regulatory leg up for alternative energy, an incentive for people on the fence to maybe pick that instead. And as for why that might be the case, how this moratorium fits into the Biden policy portfolio more generally, I will turn it over to my colleague, Catherine Janessi.
Hi, so thanks, Zach. So yeah, I'm just going to wrap up by honing in on a couple of specific provisions that we thought would be of interest to the Sea Grant community. So the first one is Section 207, which speaks to renewable energy on public lands and offshore waters. And so this provision directs the Secretary of Interior to identify steps to increase renewable energy on both public lands and offshore waters. And included with that direction is this goal of actually doubling offshore wind by 2030. But at the same time, while they're kind of identifying this goal of doubling, they're supposed to be ensuring that there's robust protection for our lands, waters, and biodiversity, and creating good jobs in the same process. When the Secretary of Interior goes through this process, he's supposed to consult with other agencies, including the administrator of NOAA, as they're going through this process. And just touching back on the tribal EO that Olivia talked about, this section also directs Interior directly to engage with tribal authorities regarding the development and management of renewable and conventional energy resources, specifically on tribal lands. Okay, so the other section I wanted to highlight for you guys today is called Empowering Workers by Advancing Conservation, Agriculture, and Reforestation, which is several sections in the EO. And the first one is the section 214 on the policy. And I just wanted to highlight this one quote that ends the actual policy statement, just because I thought it would ring true to us sea granters. So it says, coastal communities have an essential role to play in mitigating climate change and strengthening resilience by protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems, such as wetlands, seagrasses, coral and oyster reefs, and mangrove and kelp forests, to protect vulnerable coastlines, sequester carbon, and support biodiversity and fisheries. So this policy statement is just kind of setting up what some of the specific provisions are in the executive order. So next slide. So the first substantive provision of this section is focused on creating a civilian climate corps. So it directs the Secretary of Interior in collaboration with the Secretary of Agriculture and the heads of other relevant agencies to submit a strategy to the task force that Zach had mentioned within 90 days of the date of the order to create what's been called the Civilian Climate Corps Initiative. Importantly, the language says that this has to be within existing appropriations. So there's not, right now there's the idea that this wouldn't be getting its own money. But the goal of this section is to mobilize the next generation of conservation and resilience workers and maximize the creation of accessible training opportunities and good jobs. And the initiative's aims are, broad, and they can include conserving and restoring public lands and waters, bolstering community resilience, increasing carbon sequestration, protecting biodiversity, improving access to recreation, and addressing climate change. And then finally, the last section of this part of the EO is called Conserving Our Nation's Lands and Waters. It's section 216, and it has a pretty broad goal to conserve at least 30% of the lands and waters in our nation by the 2030s. It requires a report that's due within 90 days to on how we're going to maybe do this. It requires the Department of Interior to work with state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and ag and forest landowners, fishermen, and other key stakeholders in doing this. And it speaks directly to soliciting input from these groups to identify strategies that will encourage broad participation in the goal of conserving 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. This section has a specific role for the NOAA administrator, and so he or she is directed within the first 60 days from the date of the order to collect input from fishermen, regional ocean councils, fishery management councils, scientists, and other stakeholders on how to make fisheries and protected resources more resilient to climate change. And those steps, the EO says, can include changes in management and conservation measures, as well as improvements in science monitoring and cooperative research. So I think that wraps up what we wanted to cover today. So definitely let us know if you have any questions in the chat, and I'll send it back to Stephanie to wrap us up.
Thanks so much. And in case people haven't noted, as Kathy mentioned, the directive to NOAA about the climate change, that announcement, that comment period is now open. I have seen some, emails about that. So if that's something that anybody wants more information about, we can get that to you. So we're now open for questions. There have been some in the chat box that I'm going to run through, but please share your questions if you have them. Before I get to the questions, I also wanted to mention that we are considering continuing this webinar series, and we are looking for ideas about topics that would be of interest to anyone. So as you drop off, if you have things you'd like to learn more about, please put it in the chat for our consideration. So someone asked if there's a website with a list of these executive orders. So we have not compiled them on the National Sea Grant Law Center webpage. They are all available on the White House webpage. If you go to the presidential action section of that, maybe one of my colleagues can grab that and put that in the chat, but we can send that out afterwards, but they are all published on the White House website. Let's see. Someone asked if there's a way to sign up to get notifications. So the National Sea Grant Law Center does not currently have a listserv for like how we share information. We are advertising the webinars on the National Sea Grant offices, kind of all hands email list. So that's the best way to just kind of stay tuned for emails coming out about that and on social media. But we are looking into other mechanisms by which we can share information if there's enough interest in that. Oh, somebody posted the notice for the comment period for the fisheries climate resilience. So great. Thank you so much. Yes.
Stephanie?
Oh, Libby? Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, I'm in a very empty room, so like echo. But I'm wondering, is this stuff that you guys inherently are going to keep your eyes on, like the climate change, executive order, if that starts rolling into other things that become actual substantial, like, amounts of money or regulations or so on, or this is just for today's webinar and not necessarily part of something that you guys are always tracking?
Yeah, thanks, Libby. Yeah, great question. Yes, these are topics and issues that the Law Center generally tracks anyway. So the National Sea Grant Law Center tracks regulations coming out from the federal government that touch on resources of interest to Sea Grant. We pay attention to actions the agencies are taking, kind of big picture related to climate. And so, yes, we will be continuing to kind of monitor and see, how these different executive order directives are issued. Like there's a lot of calls for reports and different things that the agencies may be releasing that we'll be keeping an eye on and sharing in future webinars and in different ways with that. Olivia, there was a question regarding masks in the chat box that I'm going to read. I just wanted to give you a heads up that it was coming to you. So the mask mandate covers commercial fishing vessels, correct? And will enforcement be Coast Guard and state or just federal authority?
To my knowledge, the Coast Guard is saying in its bulletin that it will be enforcing the mask mandate. I think there are other avenues to enforce it through CDC sanctions, but I do know that the the Coast Guard is planning on enforcing at this time according to their guidance. And yes, that's correct. It applies to commercial vessels.
Yeah, and so I think there might be some question about these, again, because they're coming from executive orders to the federal government. Enforcement authority is likely limited to the Coast Guard and the federal government, but I don't know the details on state authorities that may be inspecting or implementing Coast Guard programs. So there could be some nuance there that differs by state with that. So there was a question about who the NOAA contacts are for the EO tackling climate crisis at home and abroad. I don't know that off the top of my head. If we have any NOAA Sea Grant office folks or NOAA folks on the phone that might know that, but we can also follow up after the webinar and get you that information.
Yeah, and to that funding part of the question, I just searched it real quick. It says either like the one I stated, it has to be within existing appropriations, and the other language it's using is that the actions are subject to the availability of appropriations. So I guess to be determined what money is going to be attached to it.
Thanks. Well, great. Well, it looks like the questions have slowed down a bit. So I thank everybody for their participation. If you have ideas for future webinars that you'd like to share with us, please send me an email or drop it in the chat. If you have any follow-up questions to any of the executive orders that we shared today, please send us an email. We have law students that can do additional research to answer your questions or get you more information. Your emails and feedback also help us to know what we should keep our eye on and what we should continue to look at. So we welcome engagement at any time. So thank you for your attention today. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Thanks.